The primacord lay coiled in Jake McNiece's palm like a dead snake, 6 inches of possibility wrapped in waxed cotton. In the pre-dawn darkness of Stalag Luft III's punishment block, he could barely make out the thin strand that had somehow survived 3 searches since his capture near Eindhoven. The guards had found his escape tools, his hidden maps, even the razor-blade compass he'd fashioned from stolen metal. But they'd missed this, the last remnant of his demolition training, useless for breaking walls, but perfect for what he had planned. The sound came again through the concrete. 2 taps. Pause. 3 taps. Kowalski's message from the next cell carried urgency that made McNiece's stomach clench. American prisoners were being moved at dawn, separated from the British POWs, loaded onto cattle cars, bound for camps deeper in Germany. The Russians were pushing west, and the Germans wanted their most valuable assets: airborne troops, bomber crews, officers with intelligence value, safely away from the front. McNiece pressed his ear to the wall and tapped back. Message received. His own boots, cracked leather that had carried him through the Normandy hedgerows and across the Dutch canals during Market Garden, shifted against the cold floor. 3 months since that night drop near Eindhoven, when his stick had scattered across flooded fields and he'd spent 2 weeks evading capture while German armor rolled toward the bridges his unit was supposed to defend. The memory of that operation still burned, how they'd been dropped miles off target, how the radio communications had failed, how he'd watched from a barn loft as panzer tanks rumbled past the bridge he should have been rigging with charges. The 506th PIR had fought like hell to hold their scattered positions, but without proper coordination, without the demolition work that was McNiece's specialty, too many good men had been lost or captured. Now, in the silence between Kowalski's taps, McNiece could hear other sounds: guards moving in the corridor, the distant rumble of truck engines, the metallic screech of cattle car doors being tested on their tracks. The primacord felt warm in his closed fist, 6 inches of concentrated possibility, not enough to blow a door or collapse a wall, but sufficient to create chaos if used correctly. He thought of Collins, the young P-51 pilot who'd broken during interrogation 3 weeks ago. The kid couldn't have been more than 19, shot down over the Ruhr Valley on his 2nd mission. The German intelligence officer, a soft-spoken Oberst who spoke perfect English, had methodically dismantled Collins' resolve with photographs and casualty reports until the boy finally cracked and revealed his squadron's radio frequencies. McNiece had seen that shame before, in the faces of men who'd reached their breaking point and found it sooner than they'd hoped. In Normandy, he'd watched a veteran sergeant freeze up during an artillery barrage, unable to move forward or back while his squad waited for orders. The difference was that in France, McNiece could fight back with TNT and timer fuses. Here, rebellion came in smaller packages: stolen bread, improvised maps, compasses made from magnetized razor blades. The primacord represented something more than just explosive potential. It was proof that even in captivity, a demolition man could still find ways to create controlled destruction. The question was whether 6 inches of detonation cord could buy enough confusion to give one broken pilot a chance to remember that surrender of body didn't have to mean surrender of spirit. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. Dawn brought the sound McNiece had been dreading: hobnailed boots on concrete, orders shouted in German, the metallic rattle of rifle bolts being worked. From his cell window, he could see the cattle cars lined up beyond the wire like a row of metal coffins, their doors gaping open to receive human cargo. Steam rose from the locomotive's stack, mixing with the October fog that clung to the Silesian countryside. The guards came for the solitary prisoners first. McNiece heard cell doors banging open down the corridor, heard the shuffle of men being dragged from their confinement. When his turn came, the German sergeant who unlocked his door was a middle-aged Bavarian with tired eyes and fingers stained yellow from tobacco. "Raus! Quickly now! No sudden movements!" McNiece stood slowly, his joints stiff from 8 days on the punishment block's thin mattress. The primacord was wrapped around a scrap of metal and sewn into the lining of his jacket, invisible but present like a heartbeat against his ribs. As they marched him through the compound, he spotted Collins in the formation of American prisoners, the young pilot's hands shaking as he clutched a small Bible, his eyes fixed on the ground. The Oberst who had broken Collins stood near the gate, clipboard in hand, directing the loading process with bureaucratic efficiency. McNiece had studied the German intelligence officer during their previous encounters, noting his habits, his blind spots, the slight limp where shrapnel had found its mark on some distant battlefield. The man was thorough but not cruel, treating interrogation like a chess match where patience and psychological pressure mattered more than brutality. But it was exactly that methodical approach that had destroyed Collins. The kid had expected torture, had steeled himself for physical pain. Instead, the Oberst had simply talked about burning American bombers, about casualty lists from the Pacific, about the futility of prolonging a war that Germany was clearly losing. When Collins finally broke, it wasn't from pain, but from hopelessness. McNiece watched the young pilot stumble as they approached the cattle cars, his nerve finally failing completely. 2 guards moved to steady him, their attention focused on maintaining order in the formation. This was the moment McNiece had been planning for. Not for escape, which was impossible with machine gun nests covering the loading area, but for the chance to give one broken man a reason to believe in himself again. The primacord had been intended for a more dramatic use, perhaps during transport, when confusion might create genuine escape opportunities. But seeing Collins about to collapse completely changed McNiece's calculus. Sometimes the most important demolition work wasn't about destroying bridges or bunkers. It was about blowing apart the walls of despair that trapped a man's spirit. McNiece had learned that lesson during Market Garden, when his scattered stick of the 506th PIR had regrouped near a blown bridge outside Eindhoven. They'd found a Dutch resistance fighter named Hendrik who'd been beaten by the SS, his will broken after watching his family's farm burned in retaliation for helping Allied airmen. It was McNiece who'd convinced the man to guide them to a German ammunition dump, not with speeches about duty or revenge, but with simple actions, sharing rations, treating Henrik's wounds, showing through gesture rather than words that courage could be rebuilt one small choice at a time. Now, watching Collins prepare to enter the cattle car like a lamb walking to slaughter, McNiece felt that same familiar weight of responsibility. The Filthy 13 had earned their reputation not just for insubordination and unconventional tactics, but for refusing to abandon their own, even when their own included broken strangers who'd lost faith in everything except failure. The cattle car doors stood open like mouths waiting to swallow them whole. McNiece counted the guards, 2 at each car, 1 roving supervisor, the Oberst with his clipboard maintaining his clinical distance from the actual loading process. Machine gun positions covered the approaches, but their fields of fire were designed to prevent escape, not to contain small-scale chaos. Inside the wire, other American prisoners moved with the defeated shuffle of men who'd accepted their fate. McNiece recognized bomber crews from the 8th Air Force, their leather jackets marked with squadron patches he'd seen over Normandy during the June invasion. There were infantry officers from units that had fought through the hedgerows, tankers captured during the German counter-offensive at Mortain, and a handful of paratroopers from other drops during Market Garden. News had filtered through the camp's communication network, whispered conversations during exercise periods, messages tapped through cell walls, intelligence gathered from new arrivals. The September airborne operation had achieved some objectives, but failed in its ultimate goal of ending the war before Christmas. The bridge at Arnhem remained in German hands. The corridor to the Rhine had proven untenable, and thousands of Allied paratroopers had been killed, wounded or captured in the attempt. McNiece's own memories of Market Garden carried a bitter taste of opportunities missed and plans that had looked perfect on maps but crumbled on contact with reality. His stick of the 506th PIR had been dropped near Eindhoven with orders to secure bridges and prevent German reinforcements from reaching the main battle. Instead, they'd found themselves scattered across flooded polders, fighting a running engagement with SS troops while trying to link up with British armour that was hours behind schedule. The primacord in his jacket lining had originally been intended for bridge demolitions during that operation. McNiece remembered standing on the steel span outside Eindhoven, calculating charge placement while German motorcycle patrols probed the southern approaches. The decision to retreat rather than blow the bridge had haunted him during the weeks of evasion that followed, wondering if a different choice might have saved lives, might have changed the outcome of battles he'd never seen. Collins stumbled again, nearly falling as the guards herded the prisoners toward the first cattle car. The young pilot's Bible slipped from his trembling fingers, and McNiece watched him drop to his knees, scrambling to retrieve it from the mud. The German sergeant with the tired eyes shouted an order, and Collins flinched as if expecting a blow that never came. That flinch decided everything for McNiece. He'd seen too many good men break under pressure, some in combat when fear overwhelmed training, others in captivity when isolation and interrogation stripped away their defenses. But he'd also seen how quickly courage could be rekindled by witnessing someone else's refusal to surrender hope. The primacord felt heavier against his ribs as he calculated distances, timing, and likely reactions. 6 inches wouldn't create much of an explosion, but it would make noise, draw attention, force the guards to react. In that moment of confusion, Collins might find the space to stand up straight, might remember that surrender of body didn't require surrender of spirit. McNiece thought of Henrik, the Dutch resistance fighter who'd found his courage again after losing everything. Sometimes the most important demolitions weren't about destroying enemy positions. They were about clearing away the debris of despair that accumulated in a man's heart. 6 inches of primacord might not blow a bridge, but it could blast a hole in the wall of hopelessness that trapped a 19-year-old pilot's spirit. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The moment came as Collins reached the cattle car steps. The young pilot's legs gave out completely, and he sank to his knees in the mud, clutching his Bible while German guards converged to drag him upright. McNiece saw the perfect storm of confusion. Attention focused on the collapsing prisoner, guards moving out of position, the Oberst striding over to assess the situation. McNiece had rigged the primacord around a small piece of scrap metal from his cell's broken bed frame, creating a crude noisemaker rather than a proper charge. The fuse was improvised, threads pulled from his jacket and treated with match-head phosphorus he'd scraped and saved over weeks. Not enough to cause real damage, but sufficient to create the kind of sharp crack and flash that would snap every guard's attention in one direction. He palmed the device, while the guards were focused on Collins, using the confusion to move closer to a wooden supply crate near the cattle cars. The metal scrap would amplify the small explosion, turning 6 inches of primacord into something that sounded dangerous, even if it wasn't. McNiece had learned that lesson during his first demolition training back at Tokoa. Sometimes the psychological effect mattered more than the actual destruction. The Oberst was questioning Collins now, his voice carrying the same patient tone he'd used during interrogation. McNiece could hear fragments of the conversation, demands for the pilot to stand up, explanations about transportation procedures, clinical assessments of Collins' mental state. The German officer treated even this breakdown as a problem to be analyzed and solved through proper procedure. McNiece dropped the improvised charge behind the supply crate and struck his hidden match. The fuse caught immediately. 3 seconds of burn time before the primer cord would detonate. He used those seconds to move toward Collins, close enough to reach the young pilot when confusion erupted. The explosion was smaller than anything McNiece had ever set off in combat, but in the confined space of the loading area, it seemed enormous. The sharp crack echoed off the cattle cars while smoke billowed from behind the supply crate, and suddenly every guard was spinning toward the sound, weapons rising, orders being shouted in rapid German. In that instant of chaos, McNiece reached Collins and hauled him to his feet. "Stay close, keep moving, trust your training." The words came automatically, the same phrase McNiece had whispered to scared replacements during the Normandy fighting, to Dutch civilians during Market Garden's confused retreat, to his own reflection in muddy water when fear threatened to overwhelm him. Collins looked up with surprise rather than shame for the first time in weeks, his grip on the Bible shifting from desperate clutch to steady hold. The confusion lasted perhaps 30 seconds before German efficiency reasserted control. Guards identified the source of the explosion, found no real damage, and began herding prisoners back into formation with increased urgency. But in those 30 seconds, McNiece saw Collins stand straighter, saw the young pilot's eyes focus on something beyond his own failure. They didn't resist when the guards pressed rifle muzzles against their necks, didn't try to run when orders were barked in harsh German. But McNiece noticed that Collins walked to the cattle car under his own power, helped boost another prisoner through the door, even offered a quiet word of encouragement to a bomber crewman who looked ready to collapse. The primer cord was gone, confiscated and analyzed by German intelligence officers who would puzzle over its origin and purpose. But its real mission had been accomplished. Not destruction of enemy material, but construction of something harder to measure. The knowledge that even in the darkest places, someone still cared enough to risk everything for a moment of defiance. The cattle car door slammed shut with a finality that echoed through McNiece's bones. In the darkness that followed, pressed against dozens of other prisoners in a space meant for livestock, he could hear Collins's voice for the first time in weeks. Not the broken whisper of a defeated man, but the steady cadence of someone offering comfort to others. "Easy there, friend. We'll get through this together. Just breathe." McNiece closed his eyes and felt the weight of what he'd never tell anyone about that moment at the loading platform. The explosion hadn't been a calculated act of resistance. It had been desperation, disguised as courage, the last gesture of a demolition man who'd run out of ways to fight back. 6 inches of primer cord and a lifetime of training reduced to a noisemaker that accomplished nothing except proving he still existed. The train lurched into motion, wheels grinding against track with a rhythm that would haunt McNiece's dreams for decades. In the swaying darkness, he found himself remembering another train, the one that had carried the 506th PIR toward their Market Garden drop zones in September, filled with paratroopers who'd joked and played cards and written letters they might never send. That confident journey seemed like a lifetime ago now. He remembered checking his demolition kit one final time before the jump, running mental calculations about charge placement and fuse timing, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility that came with being the man everyone expected to blow things up on schedule. The primer cord had been new then, part of a full complement of explosives meant to deny bridges and roads to German armor racing toward the airborne landing zones. But Market Garden had shattered like glass on contact with reality. The drops had been scattered, the radios had failed, and the neat timetables of the operation had dissolved into chaos within hours of landing. McNiece's stick of the 506th PIR had found themselves fighting a running battle through flooded polders while British armor struggled to reach them along a single narrow highway. The bridge outside Eindhoven had been the moment that broke something inside him. Standing on that steel span, with German patrols closing from both directions, McNiece had faced a choice: blow the bridge and deny it to enemy armor, or preserve it for Allied forces who might never arrive. He'd chosen to retreat, to preserve his men and his explosives for another mission that never came. For weeks afterward, while evading capture in the Dutch countryside, he'd tortured himself with alternative scenarios. What if he'd rigged the charges anyway? What if his demolition had prevented German reinforcements from reaching Arnhem? What if one NCO's decision could have changed the outcome of an entire operation? The truth he'd never admitted to anyone, not even under interrogation, was that he'd been afraid. Not of dying, he'd made peace with that possibility long ago, but of making the wrong choice, of destroying something that might have saved other men's lives. The 6 inches of primacord he'd hidden through months of captivity had become a talisman of that failure, a reminder that sometimes even experienced demolition men froze when the stakes were highest. Using it to help Collins hadn't been heroic. It had been selfish, a desperate attempt to prove to himself that he could still make decisions under pressure, could still choose courage over paralysis. The young pilot's recovery had given McNiece something he'd lost at that Dutch bridge: the knowledge that small actions could matter, that timing and placement applied to human hearts as well as explosive charges. In the darkness of the cattle car, listening to Collins comfort other prisoners, McNiece finally understood what his old sergeant had meant during demolition training. The hardest targets to destroy were the ones inside a man's own head. The new camp was worse than Stalag Luft 30, barracks built for half their population, guards who saw the approaching Soviet offensive in every prisoner's eyes, and rations that barely qualified as subsistence. But something had changed during that train journey, something that showed in the way Collins carried himself and the quiet network of communication he'd begun building among the American prisoners. McNiece found himself assigned to a work detail clearing rubble from roads damaged by Allied bombing. The irony wasn't lost on him, using his demolition expertise in reverse, rebuilding what his comrades in the air war had destroyed. But the work gave him access to materials, to small pieces of metal and wire that could be fashioned into tools or weapons, or simply reminders that resourcefulness hadn't died with capture. Collins appeared one evening during the brief recreation period, carrying a chess set carved from scraps of wood and a proposal that made McNiece smile for the first time in months. "I've been thinking about what you said at the train. About trusting your training. I want to start teaching some of the younger prisoners about resistance, about keeping morale up. Nothing dramatic, just ways to remember who we are." The young pilot had transformed his breakdown into a kind of strength, using his experience with interrogation to help other prisoners prepare for their own encounters with German intelligence officers. McNiece watched Collins work with new arrivals, teaching them breathing techniques, memory exercises, ways to compartmentalize information without losing their sense of self. It was Collins who organized the memorial service when news reached them of the German offensive in the Ardennes, of American units surrounded and fighting desperate battles in the snow. They had no chaplain, no formal prayers, just a circle of men standing in silence while someone read names from a list that grew longer each week. McNiece contributed his own memories to that informal liturgy: friends lost during the Normandy drops, paratroopers who died in Dutch polders during Market Garden, the bomber crews who'd never returned from missions over Germany. But he also shared stories of courage he'd witnessed: a medic who'd crawled through artillery fire to reach wounded men, a Dutch family who'd hidden Allied airmen despite the risk to their own children. Liberation came in April 1945, when Soviet tanks rolled through the camp gates and German guards simply melted away into the confusion of a collapsing Reich. McNiece stood in the compound, breathing free air for the first time in 8 months. and found himself thinking not of revenge or relief, but of the 6 inches of primer cord that had somehow changed 2 lives in a moment of controlled chaos. Collins sought him out during the evacuation, as Allied aircraft landed to ferry former prisoners back to friendly lines. The young pilot carried himself differently now, not with the swagger of unearned confidence, but with the quiet steadiness of someone who'd found courage in the darkest place and learned to share it with others. "Thank you." They were the only words Collins said, but they carried the weight of understanding that stretched back to that moment at the cattle cars. McNiece nodded and shook the young man's hand, feeling the calluses that came from months of prison labor, the steady grip that spoke of inner strength rebuilt through small acts of daily resistance. Neither man mentioned the explosion or the primer cord or the specific mechanism of what had happened. Some stories were too important to reduce to their component parts. Decades later, when Jake McNiece was an old man telling stories to grandchildren who'd never seen war, he would remember Collins not as the broken pilot he'd helped at the loading platform, but as the steady teacher who'd shown dozens of prisoners how to survive captivity with their dignity intact. The primer cord had been consumed in a moment, but the courage it represented had multiplied through months of quiet resistance. Sometimes, McNiece would reflect while watching freight trains pass through his Oklahoma hometown. The most important demolitions weren't about destroying bridges or bunkers. They were about blasting through the walls that trapped the human spirit, clearing away the debris of despair, one small explosion at a time. If this story reminded you that behind every medal and mission report, there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.